Greetings, my friends. Father Leo here again. And my topic today is International Women's Day. And of course, in 1975, the United Nations declared that March the 9th would be known as International Women's Day. And it has been proclaimed and honored ever since. And the idea behind proclaiming March the 9th as International Women's Day was that the UN was encouraging countries throughout the world to act on this, to move on it, because they really felt that there was a disparity between the way men were allowed to live and women. And in many places, women were oppressed, considered to be second-class citizens, not as important or as capable as men. So there was a lot of cultural values that were certainly discriminating against women and needed to be rectified. And ever since 1975, women throughout the world have got organized and have certainly made their voices heard. Now it's difficult to make their voices heard because if for so long men have been in charge in our society, politically, economically, socially, and particularly in the churches. And so there's a whole power structure there. And women are not sharing equally in the power structure. And of course, with that inequality and exclusion, it's hard for men to get change. But they're working at it, and I really believe that women will indeed someday break through and be accepted and seen and honored as equal to men in all our societies throughout the world. I think that when I read Karen Armstrong's book, The History of God, she gives one explanation which may or may not be it. From 20,000 BC to 10,000 BC, as you know, the men were hunters and gatherers, and so the women were stay at home. But in staying at home, they were in charge. They were in charge of the spirituality of the people. They were in charge of the governance of the people. They were in charge of the economics. So in many ways, the women played a very, very important role. And as she points out in her book, particularly in the area of religion, they were the ones who had the God that we are kind of proclaiming today, the God that can be found and experienced in nature. So the women were much truer because at the agricultural revolution, 10,000 BC, now that the men discovered that by tilling the earth, planting seeds, harvesting, they could raise food at home. And so they started staying at home and no longer hunting and gathering. And of course, when they did, somehow impelled by male force, they got the upper hand. And a couple things we know is, number one, they took God and they made him a male. Before that, it was a feminine God. And once they got a male God, they put him up in the sky. I call him the sky god. And that pretty well took over. And even today, you still get a lot of people who think that see God up in the sky. And not only that, but the men who became the leaders of their tribe projected onto God the qualities of a man. That's the interesting part. Now, it's the qualities, the male qualities as these saw them. So be careful here now. They were projected up and said, this is what God is like. This is what God is like. The all-powerful one. And the God who would judge the living and the dead. But a distant God. So that's what happened. And Karen Armstrong describes that very well in her book. Very, very well. Now, and of course, whether that's not the only explanation. There could be others that I'm not aware of. And I don't know whether this one is accurate or not. But anyway, it's worth thinking about, I guess. And where we are today, of course, we can certainly look around in our own hometown, in our own country, and around the world. And it has evolved. It has evolved where women are more and more excluded. They're no longer considered equal to men. And in many places, they're oppressed and discriminated against and disempowered. So it's all wrong, especially for we who call ourselves Christians. It's wrong, dead wrong. Because as Christians, we can go back to the scriptures. And in the book of Genesis, it says God created women and men in the image of God. So right off the bat, that old author from long ago got it right. Isn't that interesting? He got it right, or she got it right, whichever it was, and created in the image and likeness of God, and that God is holistic, and therefore there's going to be equality and inclusivity because that's God. However, for the people who hung on to a male God, they weren't going to buy that. They weren't going to buy it. No. And no, they weren't. They still had a sense that Adam came first and Eve came second. Well, that was a story. That's a metaphor. And the author of Genesis wasn't trying to tell us that it's all right to treat women as being unequal to men. At no time. So we have Genesis. And then, of course, we have Jesus himself. And when you read the scriptures, the New Testament particularly, you find out that, first of all, Jesus surrounded himself with women who were both a supportive community. So they were his supportive community, along with the 12 disciples, of course, 12 apostles. But it was equal. Men and women were equal in that community. It wasn't that the men were it and the women weren't. They were equal participants in his ministry. That's number one. And Jesus certainly showed us that women were to be included and treated as equals. Now, the little bit we know about the early church, of course, is that in the beginning, women did play a very important role after Pentecost. They really did. They were involved in the ministries in many various ways. But as the church evolved, again, part of that evolution were the men who once more came to the top, in the sense that they took to themselves the power to govern, to rule, to decide who did what in the church, who was in, who was out, and men were in, women were out. As far as ministry was concerned, certainly they were barred from the ordination as deacons, although there were early deacons in the very early church, women deacons, and also priesthood. So that kind of male thinking, patriarchy, hierarchy, and other kinds of archies, all argued against the inclusion of women as equals. And so, in many ways, I think you have to say that the church has failed women. Now, we know that a lot of women down through the centuries went along with it because their culture was the same thing. So what they got in church on Sunday, they got the same thing during the week. So pretty soon they're starting to, well, church can't be wrong, you know. After all, Father knows best. God, if they just really knew, if they just really knew how little Father knows, they wouldn't have settled for Father knows best. So that's how it kind of has evolved. And today, March the 9th, the International Women's Day, women have got organized. And as such, they're speaking up. Their voices are being heard out there. And women are starting to say to themselves, we are empowered. Just because we're women, that's enough. We don't have to compete with men. And we just have to be women who've got our own gifts and talents, our intelligence, our love and compassion, and all the gifts and talents which women have. And their voices is being pronounced throughout the world, and especially here in our own country on March the 9th, where women are speaking out, and Catholic women are saying, come on, church, get with the times. You're 200 years behind the times. And that's true. We're living in the 21st century. And as followers of Jesus, we really have to take seriously our failure. The hierarchy needs to see clearly the teachings of Jesus. We need to say clearly how that has been failed as regards women. Failure, big time. And how men with hierarchy have been able to run the church, have been empowered, can control people, especially women and their voice, and exclude them from ministry. So I have to say, in all honesty, it's wrong, wrong, wrong. And our leaders, if you want to call them that, have got to get with the times. And also, they've got to be true to our roots, which go back to the Old Testament and go back to the New Testament, where it proclaims loud and clear the equality of men and women, the inclusion of women, the rights of women. And the hierarchy has got to realize we've got to face reality. We've got to let go our clinging to power, because power gives us control over people. And we're not supposed to be controllers. We are supposed to be people, clergy I'm talking about, who minister to people. Minister. We are servants of the people of God. And unless the hierarchy and clergy buy into that, then it's not going to see much of a change. We've got to, they used to talk about the comfortable pew. Well, now we talk about the comfortable sanctuary, where all the guys gather, whether it's on Sunday morning or a special celebration where there's 40 or 50 men in the sanctuary. Time has come, boys. The time has come. And the churches will continue to empty if we don't get real and be true to the gospel. And if we are true to the gospel, then we have every reason to believe that something good will happen. We have to. I'll tell you one story before I go. A few years ago, a friend of mine died, an Anglican, and he was being buried from an Anglican church, so naturally I went to the service. And I sat in the pew with some of my friends. And at the appointed hour, the priest announced everybody to stand for the opening hymn, which we did. And the priest processed up the center aisle, went into the sanctuary, began the service, and it flowed along very nicely. Now I have to tell you, the service was about half over when suddenly I saw. My eyes were open. The priest presider was a woman. And it was beautiful. The way she conducted that service was beautiful and quite capable. And her words were comforting, encouraging, hope-filled, and certainly she served the family of the deceased very well. And so, and I know many other Christian churches who have female pastors. And why not? If they're being faithful to the gospel, and that's the criteria, not the core values of our society, the cultural values. They're the wrong ones in many instances. Our values are the values from the gospel. And like I said, up to this point, we have failed to live the gospel values. And on this International Women's Day, March the 9th, 2020, I call to all my male friends, priests. I call on the hierarchy. We stand up every Sunday and tell people to do their duty, to do what's right. So I'm calling you out today, calling you out and challenge you to stand up for what is right. Stand up and act for what is right. And if you do that, there's every reason to believe that you are then the voice of God. But to remain silent on this issue is not good enough anymore. That day of silence is long gone. As I said, we are 200 years behind the time. Let's catch up before our churches are completely emptied. God bless.